issues, which might actually also refer to some of the themes in the election as well, because I think the talk this evening will cross a couple of issues to do with citizenship. So I would like to first of all introduce our main speaker for this evening, Dr. Ravinda Sidhu, who is from the University of Queensland. She's in the School of Education. Her research interests are in the sociology of transnational education, comparative and international higher education, and student mobilities. And in fact, Ravinda is very closely associated with a group in the National University of Singapore working on globalizing universities and student mobilities. Ravinda herself is a very well-published, very accomplished author. One of her books has to do with the universities and globalization, and subtitled To Market, To Market. So, and she's also worked as a policy advisor in the areas of educational aid and international student welfare in Australia. So I think without further ado, let's hear from Ravinda, after which there will be a short commentary from another of our well-loved academics in NUS, and I'll introduce her later. So let's put our hands together first to welcome Ravinda Sidhu.
Thank you for that very generous introduction, Brenda. I'm delighted to be here this evening, and I want to extend my thanks to Brenda for inviting me to talk about student migration. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Ari and NUS for support to do research here, and I think this is a theme that resonates for lots of researchers like me. My association with Ari goes back to 2007, and together Ari and NUS have provided a space to do fieldwork in the region, which is wonderful, and also a space, more importantly, for intellectual engagement, time to think, and time to rework ideas and just see what other people are doing. So thank you. Tonight I'm going to start with an overview of some of the trends underlying student migration and the social transformations which shape these trends. I'm going to then move on to discuss Australia's policy of two-step migration, because I think it has some value or some resonances for Singapore. Now, two-step migration is where students come to a country initially to study and then apply onshore for permanent residency. From then on, I'm going to move on to talk about human security of student migrants, taking as a focal point the issues surrounding Indian student migrants, particularly in 2008 and 2009 in Australia. I'll then close with a discussion of Sen, Amartya Sen's capabilities approach and how it can further thinking on human security and human rights for student migrants. And if there's time, we can talk about human rights and Asian values. Okay. At the outset, I want to say that getting an accurate comparative picture of student migrants is pretty difficult. First, because definitions vary across countries. There's no agreed upon definition that everyone is using about who is a student migrant and who is an international student. This definition out here is relatively new, came about in 2006, put together by the OECD. It's international students, anyone who crosses borders for the purposes of study, innocuous enough, but not every country uses this definition. So countries like the US and Germany prefer the term foreign student, and Germany counts its Turkish permanent residents as international students on the basis that they are non-nationals and they have completed part of their education in another country. So basically what this means is that it skews the numbers, okay? And the OECD and UNESCO are relying on countries to provide data. Definitions of migrants, again, equally diverse. This is an arguably very general definition. someone who's been resident in a destination country for more than 12 months. But once again, there's a diversity around how it's interpreted. In Australia, until 2006, we did not count international students as migrants. They were international students. And then in 2006, the Bureau of Statistics changed the criteria. A migrant was someone who spent 12 out of the last 16 months in Australia. So once that definition was changed, we saw a huge increase in the number of technical migrants. And what can I say? Migration is politically very charged, and it's setting to train all kinds of debates and discussions. So definitions, as you can see, have a political meaning. They are not objective, and international comparative data is usually dated. I have to say that some of the figures that I'm going to show you today go back to 2008. Okay, so, and we're in 2011. Okay, who's going where? Again, no surprises here. The main destination countries are the OECD countries. The US leads, followed by the UK, France, and Germany. And then all these players have different rationales for international student recruitment. Okay, I won't go into too much of detail here, but I've elaborated on it in my paper. And students choose these destination countries because of the reputation of their universities, in particular the reputation insofar as research capacity goes. So even undergraduate students are influenced by the research profile of universities. Cost is also a factor for some countries, and as you can see over there, there's a differential fee structure for international students, depending on where they're going. The UK and Australia, and I think New Zealand, charge full fees for international students. Some of the Nordic countries have no fees for domestic or international students. And countries like Germany, France, Japan, Korea, and the US have the same fee structure for domestic and international students. So Australia is very entrepreneurial. Okay, other factors impacting on student choice, obviously language of instruction. English is now the international language of business, commerce, and science. And those countries that are English-speaking have a definite advantage. Unfortunately, what this has meant is that more and more countries are offering to teach courses in English, even if they don't have, English-speaking heritage. And I think there's a question there about the quality of some of those courses. And finally, migration. For countries like Australia, the opportunity to migrate is a key factor in why students choose to come to Australia. 50% of all international students globally come from Asia, with China and India as, producing the most numbers. So in a sense, countries like China and India have formidable market power. And in the recent past, certainly the Chinese government has discouraged its nationals from traveling to New Zealand because at some point they were concerned about the pastoral care students were receiving. So countries are very powerful and I think it did quite a lot of damage, for a while at least, to New Zealand's export industry. Okay. All right. These figures on economic impact for the US. Every country tries to break down what international students bring to the economy, and these figures are for 2008 and 2009. It's about $17 billion once they take away the support that the US government and private institutions give, which is about 30% of international students on some kind of financial aid. So quite a lot of money there. And in 2009, 2010, that figure in terms of economic impact was estimated at about $20 billion US. In the medium term, at least, the US is likely to maintain its position as a leading study destination despite its economic difficulties and despite its declining superpower status. And the reasons are reputation and global prestige of their research universities. And this is helped by the league tables that continuously remind us all how great the American universities are. Now, in 2010, I think Shanghai Jiaotong worked out that 8 out of the top 10 universities were based in the US. and 54 out of the top 100 were American universities. So you see a sort of a virtuous cycle of excellence here. You know, several of these universities have formidable endowment bases, and then they have these really, good league ratings. It helps them to attract more students and more scholars who do really good work, more endowments, and their reputational profiles just keep growing. The US is also popular because of global culture. It's popular culture, and I think the outward expansion of American branch campuses or universities, whether it's Yale in Singapore or Chicago Graduate School of Business here, New York University in Abu Dhabi, these are just going to strengthen brand America. Okay, all right. Just a quick picture to show you pictorially how cross-border flows have increased. So in 1975, there were only 0.8 million students crossing borders, and now we're looking at 3.3 million people crossing borders. Why this escalation in demand for cross-border education? Well, a simple answer would be social transformations, some associated with globalization, some with regionalization, and some just the dynamics in particular countries. Certainly, the growing mobility of students has a material base in the global reach of capitalism and an ideological base in neoliberalism. So countries like New Zealand, UK, and Australia, for instance, are selling education, and that's part and parcel of neoliberal policies to try and offset burdens on the education budgets. For countries like Singapore, the project of remodeling itself into a knowledge economy has been pivotal in the formulation of a global schoolhouse policy, and more about global schoolhouse in a minute. Countries like China are moving into the international education market, and I think we can see really big changes in the next 10 years as more, probably like manufacturing, as China gets into the picture, the terrain is going to change. But most international students who go to China go to study the humanities. They come from proximate countries and they go to study the humanities. So China is certainly going to be capitalizing on interest in Mandarin. At the same time, there is an increasing presence of foreign providers in China. So one of the conditionalities for China's membership in the World Trade Organization was it had to give market access to foreign providers in education. So Nottingham University is based in Ningbo, and it has quite a large number, again, of foreign students coming from the region, where Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan, some Thai students. Kaplan, the US education provider, it's big in China. It does a lot of pathway-type courses and diploma-type courses for students. So I think the Chinese picture is complicated, but the private sector there is going to thrive. Another reason for, I guess, the growth in cross-border flows is demographic changes. Countries with a demographic dividend, countries like China and India, where they have a high proportion of young people have a capacity problem. And in the short term, that is not going to get solved. So their young people face very stiff competition to get into local universities, and they will look outwards and continue to do that. Countries with aging populations like Singapore and Japan are actively recruiting students for migration purposes. Japan also to build its international profile. And as I said earlier on, the global spread of English, the globalization of league table rankings intensifies desire for people to go overseas. Finally, we can anticipate that the whole discourse of rising Asia is going to increase interest in Asia as a study destination. These are very, very general trends. Ultimately, research really needs to focus on each site very, very carefully to look at the dynamics in each site. Okay. All right, I'm going to race to this destination, Asia. Who's going to Asia? Well, China has currently 7% of the world's international students, Japan about 4%. Singapore and Malaysia 2% each, and I couldn't get the figures on Korea. As I said earlier, all these countries have slightly different rationales, but none of them are around revenue raising, okay? Singapore and Japan, and to some extent Korea, I think, are seeking to move up the value chain economically. They're hoping to build capacity in knowledge-driven production. And Japan in particular, and Singapore too, I think, are trying to elevate the international standing of their universities. The imperative to seek migrants is probably stronger in Singapore than in Japan. Malaysia's rationale is maybe more around education exports. And typically, Malaysia is very interesting. There's a geographical or ethno-cultural stratification of markets. The private sector gets most of its students from China, from Korea, and Indonesia. The public sector goes to the Middle East, to the Islamic countries, and North Africa. Okay, just a slightly dated pie chart showing the OECD dominance, but Asia picking up. All right, we're mainly a Singaporean audience here, so this is, things that you all know. Global Schoolhouse project. And US is, as Brenda mentioned, is heading a study looking at East Asian universities. Singapore is one of the sites. Global Schoolhouse, you've seen it in newspapers, you've heard about it. It has 3 planks. 1, to bring in international students across from schooling, university, early childhood, across the board. So the target is 150,000 by last year, and I think that target's been met. But maybe you can enlighten me on that. Second, well, invite the world-class universities to establish partnerships or standalone establishments. So MIT at Create, before that the Singapore MIT Alliance, the NUS Yale College, sorry, I put Yale first. Oh, is it? Okay. The Duke NUS Medical School, the Singapore University of Design and Technology. Now, this model is very interesting. Oh, and the last plank, of course, is to build entrepreneurial capacity and creativity in the curriculum, in the pedagogy, right throughout the education system, from schooling right up to university. And that's marketed heavily as well. Now, the Singaporean model is very interesting. It's pretty much like a development assistance model. As far as higher education goes. It's a kind of policy Australia and the UK had about 30 years ago. So it's a kind of Keynesian logic there. The trade or marketization takes place probably in the private sector, and the public sector is not there to raise revenue. Is it sustainable? I don't know. This is a really wealthy country. It has a unique political culture and an openness to foreign elements. And the question, though, is how sustainable will this model be in the long term? Countries like Australia have enormous welfare, needs, like really big. I think our welfare budget is enormous. There's very little chance that the population would allow the government to fund kind of an elite higher education model. So be interesting to see where that goes. Singapore's brand identity, again, Singapore does a lot of branding. The images and slogans are constantly updated. At the moment, the focus is on the cosmopolitan city, global knowledge, Asian insights, that sort of hybridity, the East-West hybridity. Okay. Talent capital, everyone's really happy. A strong can-do ethos. And it's fascinating because I think of all the countries, Singapore probably does the most marketing. It markets itself as a knowledge hub, as a talent destination and so on, but obviously not for revenue. And these images are updated constantly. I'd say every 3 to 6 months you'll have something new up. Really slick, really. Okay. Who's going to Japan? I won't spend too much of time, just very quickly. As you can see, it's the proximate countries, China, South Korea, Taiwan. These figures are a little bit dated. China is the biggest source of international students and probably will continue to be. Who's going to China? Again, the proximate countries, South Korea. Japan, and the US. The US tends to send students mainly for short-term study abroad type programs or, graduate studies with a focus on humanities. This is quite dated, I'm afraid. It's from the Chinese Department of Education. Okay, moving on. Leaving these trends aside and moving on to a different scale from the national down to the individual, I want to talk about some of the lived realities for international students and some of the issues that they encounter which impact on their human security. For mobile individuals and populations, as you know, migration is a double-edged sword. It has the potential for hugely positive consequences, whether it's technology transfer, knowledge transfer, remittances. Migration is really positive for enhancing human capabilities. At the same time, it's also important to acknowledge that migration can really destabilize the security of people, particularly young people who are going to a very different social-cultural climate. The changes in language, in culture, in food, in climate without the supportive network of family and friends. Now, in examining the literature on international student experiences, what is clear is really a similarity of concerns across different destination countries. The degrees of this issue versus that might vary, but as a general rule, international students have these sorts of issues: lack of equal respect and intercultural mixing, financial difficulties, housing. Housing is a huge problem now for many students in big cities. And some of you might have read an article in the Straits Times yesterday about the realities of living in Sydney. You see what is promoted as the harbour, the beautiful city, but in actual fact, international students, all students, are living almost in slum accommodation or exposed to slum accommodation. Healthcare is an issue. Access to public services in Australia. Victoria and New South Wales do not give international students any concessions to travel on public transport. So every other student will get a concession, but not an international student. And that has been a beef for a long time because public transport in Australian cities is not cheap. Immigration as a concern, safety, I'm going to talk about that, particularly given that many students are visibly different, and loneliness. Okay. I'll leave you to read that. Intercultural mixing, here are two accounts. And thanks to Michelle for that first quote. She's not here, but she gave me that quote. And then he goes on to say that, this is an exchange, and he frequently asks Singaporean students to go out to a movie or go out to have something. They say, no, I'm too busy. But then he'll see them slumped asleep in the library over their books out of exhaustion. Okay, and this is a quote of someone that I interviewed in Monash in Malaysia. Okay, so while university presidents and vice chancellors routinely laud the cultural diversity of the institution, we have people from 25 nations. This is a veritable United Nation. The reality is student migrants often find themselves isolated from host country students. International students speak of hi-bye friends, and local students who are just comfortable in their networks and reluctant to step out. As a general rule, most international students will tell you that they don't set out to mix just with co-nationals, but that's just how it ends up being. Okay. This one's another student. So, whether it's mundane barriers or, in this account, more entrenched prejudices, intercultural mixing and equal respect is an issue for students and for universities. We might talk about transnational citizenship and intercultural competence, but we have a long, long way to go, certainly in Australia, to build it into the curriculum and build it into the culture of universities so it translates onto students. Okay, I'm now going to move on to talk about two-step migration and issues of human security relating to international students. As I said earlier, what's two-step migration? It involves students first coming to a country to study and then seeking permanent residency. Now, in Australia, this policy was only introduced in 2001. And in doing so, the government actually brought together the migration and education export industries, formally articulated it. I've chosen this example because I think it tells us something about the unintended consequences arising from social policy. We have this notion that, governments think hard, they formulate a policy, they have all these rational conceptions, they go around looking at best practice, and then they come together with this brilliant policy. But there are always unintended consequences, and policies are a blunt instrument. So prior to 2001, there's a 3-year wait. International students come to Australia and then have to return either to their home country or to another country, a third country, before they can apply for permanent residency. Okay, and the rationales of the policy when they changed it was a view that the Australian qualified would be more employable, that they would cut down on unemployment rates. I think another rationale, it wasn't made explicit, but when I was interviewing people in Canberra, they were saying to me, it's also to make the education export industry more attractive. There's a lot of competition now, and we're trying to give them a helping hand. So the policy effectively joined up migration and education. A list of occupations in demand was made up by the Immigration Department. It's the Migration, Occupation and Demand list. And interestingly, English proficiency was removed. So before that, if you want to migrate, you have to do an English test. So the rationale there was, if students have come in, they've completed a university degree, hey, their English must be okay, right? Yeah. But what they didn't really, the policymakers didn't pay attention to was just how deregulated and marketized the education system was, and just what the consequences were going to be. So what ended up happening, of course, was a huge surge in migration-driven enrollments. Okay? The biggest source countries were India and China. And from India, most of the students came from the state of Punjab, and from China, they came from Fujian province. And they were actually selecting courses specifically for one reason, which was to improve their migration status. Okay, so what happened? I guess most of the research that's been done on two-step migration, it's not a lot of it, and the researchers probably had their own agendas, but poor career outcomes for this group, okay? The policy drew in a very broad class spectrum of migrants, and the labor market outcomes were not very good. So in accounting, for instance, less than 22% of the students or graduates in accounting were employed, compared to 57% of English-speaking background migrants, student migrants, and 64% of Australian graduates. Okay, for Chinese students, it was even lower. It was like 16%. So it really, and low language proficiency was one reason, though you also have to factor in the fact that, after several years of a white Australia policy and some ambivalence towards multiculturalism, that there are also issues around racism there. Okay. There's very little ethnographic research into this group of migrants, the ones that have come out on two-step migration. One study that did look into it was Michel Baus from Amsterdam University. He was a PhD student. He came in and he, basically just immersed himself with the Indian students, and he found basically that families had borrowed really heavily to finance their children's education and migration. They took risky loans, many overvalued their properties, and some delved into dowry endowments. So, using dowries as a means of financing usually their son's education. So particularly from the Punjab, it's a very gendered group. Now, on the one hand, this illustrates the very creative ways in which individuals can circumvent the workings of a state and find loopholes. But the personal costs have been very high. So students arriving knowing that their parents had such a big debt felt compelled to find work as quickly as possible, to combine study and work, often breaking the conditions of their visa, which is 20 hours only. Many worked in, in service industries, driving taxis, for instance, long, unsociable hours, and, being out and about in a city outside these sociable hours certainly put them at risk. Okay, here are some of the pictures of the protest by Indian students in Melbourne. The students, in fact, formed an international student movement using many of the tactics and strategies you find around civil society in India. Those of you who are familiar with Melbourne, some of you probably are familiar with Melbourne, you'll be aware that the main transport artery in the city is near Flinders Street Station and Swanston Street. So the students, who were really, a lot of them were cab drivers, part-time, they parked their cabs and blocked off the intersection and then sat down in the intersection at peak hour, okay? So you can just imagine, it was one of the biggest protests in Melbourne in terms of stopping the traffic. And their concerns, this particular one was, it was framed around racism, but the issues were around physical safety. And several Indian student taxi drivers had been quite badly hurt, okay? Other incidents, of course, were also escalating emotions, and they happened while students were traveling on public transport. In most of these incidences, the perpetrators quite often were either teenagers, okay, or other young people of a migrant background, and in some cases, indigenous young people. So while the students were claiming racism in their protests, the more pertinent issue, I think, is their social circumstances and how the human security was compromised. I should also add that certainly with the Punjabi students, there's been a lot of social isolation that they've experienced, okay? And this is really because of class-based divisions within the Indian heritage communities. Most of the early migrants into Australia have come as business people or professional people. And many of these young people, the more recent student migrants, are from a different class spectrum. So people in the community were very divided about the openness of these protests. I think some were very uncomfortable, okay? Even Bollywood got into the act. Australia's image took such a battering. And those of you who know anything about Bollywood culture, this is Mr. Good Guy in all the Bollywood movies. He's called Amitabh Bachchan. And here he is refusing an honorary PhD from an Australian university, not mine, by the way. He had been offered a PhD, and he said, well, my conscience doesn't permit me to accept this. Okay, so what happens in Australia is that we had a number of reviews to look at the impact of the migration education nexus. In 2008, there was a review into the skill migration program and into two-step migration. And it basically led to a tightening up of visa conditions, okay? The financial liquidity arrangements were strengthened considerably. So the policy pendulum, in a way, had swung completely from looking at students as potentially highly skilled labor migrants to now viewing them as, a migration risk. In the midst of, and I think it's no surprise that, the visa requirements were tightened up while the global financial crisis was on. So certainly the Australian public or the Australian policymakers were feeling the heat, okay? Then in 2009, there was a Baird review that was on the consumer protection mechanisms for international students. Were they sufficient? And it looked at a particular piece of legislation and made some recommendations about improving regulation, particularly for the vocational education sector. Now, Mr. Baird, who's just retired, but is one of the breed of a well-regarded Australian politician, he said he was shocked at the level of shonky activity. We have been all fixated on the money rather than anything else, was what he said. Right now, there's the Knight Review that's ongoing. And the interesting thing about this is universities have put in submissions to the Knight Review, and they want to have the job of assessing migration risk of students. So, so that will be another administrative role. that universities will take on. Okay, so what's the price that individuals pay for seeking PR the two-step way? I think this account is probably quite common. It's the fallout. I think you can read the print. So on the one hand, we say that students are really savvy, they've got access to information, they read all the policies, but some kind of information asymmetry seems to be happening because you have a situation like this person's, and you do have a situation where families are suffering. So a policy decision by the government to articulate migration and international education has certainly taken people's money and opened up significant risks to their security. Now, while I've talked a bit about the policy, the two-step policy, I should add that the migration education nexus is consolidated in other ways as well. Universities routinely in Australia use agents to source students and pay commissions accordingly. And it's not unusual for education agents to also work as migration agents. Okay? And I think some of Francis's work has certainly pointed to that. So it's a particularly big problem in the Indian subcontinent, but it seems to be a problem elsewhere as well. Okay, so summing up, student migration is politically charged, especially in the face of economic difficulties, as you've seen here in the election. In Australia, we also have concerns about the environment, which intrude into the debate. Can we have a big Australia? And typically a long-standing ambivalence to multiculturalism. In the US, we saw a change of attitudes after 9/11, and I think really this threat of terrorism might come up again, even though Osama is out of the picture, and there could be some impact on student migrants. Okay. All right, so the policy pendulum swinging back. This is what the Home Secretary in the UK said just last month. So once again, we're seeing the student migrant going from being in policy discourse, highly skilled talent, to a migration risk. And some of the initiatives are going to be, cutting down on student visas, and on post-study options, okay? And there's a lot of intensive lobbying going on at the moment. Okay, we can anticipate in the future more students on the move, and I think all this ambivalence in Australia and the UK is going to go in Asia's favor. Countries like Singapore, will move in quickly. Intra-Asia movements will definitely increase as China forges ahead to recruit more international students. I think we can anticipate a broader spectrum of abilities in international students, some more second chance students, like as Kong Chong refers to them, and we can also anticipate a broader class spectrum of students, so they may not have the kind of financial resources which in the past we associated with international students. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I note that the presence of foreigners was a salient election issue here in Singapore. And I'm not taking a position either way here. But the point I'm making is, as in Australia, international students are invited. And to paraphrase the critical race activist Sivanandan, they are over here because we go out there and ask them to come over, whether it's a marketing agent, whether it's an embassy official going to a school, but there is a huge amount of activity to go out there and invite them to come over. Okay. All right. What rights should students have to ensure their human security? And again, human security is a bigger or smaller issue for different countries. Okay. It may not be a big issue for Singapore's international students, particularly those who are coming to the public institution. But I would be very surprised if it's not an issue for those in the private sector institutions. What are the responsibilities of the individual student, the state, and universities, for instance? What rights that we enjoy should we subtract from students because they're temporary? I'm not sure if there's a stock answer to any of these. Should we consider them at the outset as potential citizens? But these are debates we need to actually get our heads around as researchers, and I guess as administrators and as citizens. Okay. In thinking about the rights of mobile populations like student migrants, it's important not to limit ourselves to frameworks, be they national or global. Simon Marginson and his colleagues have pointed out, rightly so, that much of student life is lived outside of the realm of state regulation and market contracts, everyday life. So while Australia, for instance, is a signatory to all kinds of human rights frameworks, that doesn't mean that those rights assist students in attaining human security. And in Singapore has typically taken a very pragmatic view to human rights and is not a signatory to global frameworks. Some of you might have followed the UN Universal Periodic Review that Singapore just submitted to, and the issue of migrant rights has appeared there. Okay, in educational sociology, which is really my disciplinary area, there's a move to rethink and reconceptualize students. Rather than regarding them in instrumental terms as human capital and sites for investment, there's a need now, and there's a need to look at their capabilities and their functioning. And Amitabh Bachchan's work on capabilities is a potentially broader, richer framework for rethinking the needs of student migrants. So what are capabilities? Sen refers to capabilities as the freedom to achieve, well-being, to be and to do. And functioning, say, the practical realizations of human security. And human security can involve basic needs, food, shelter, freedom from threats, and more complex needs, social recognition, affirmation, autonomy, agency. And at the center of Sen's approach is the matter, really, of ethical individualism. Every human being matters, no matter where they come from. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravinder, for distilling out of that all those various complex pictures, various issues, which I think has a resonance with us as well in Singapore in our endeavor to become an educational hub and so forth. I will now ask Associate Professor Shalina Huang, who's from the Department of Geography here in NUS, and she's also the Vice Dean of Graduate Studies at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, so she actually has a role to play in terms of inviting students to NUS. And her work focuses largely on gender and migration within the Asian region, as well as urbanization and heritage conservation. And she has many projects going on right now, including one on the transnational mobilities of healthcare workers, another important issue, transnational families and national identity, as well as a project on the internet and religion. So she is very well placed to come and give us some comments in relation to the topic of the day on student migration. Yeah, so Shalina.
Thank you, Brenda, and thank you, Ravinder, for your very interesting paper. I thoroughly enjoyed reading her paper in preparation for giving my comments. I must say it really resonated with me. I was just in China a couple of weeks ago, testing students there in terms of the English, wooing the brightest and best to come to FASS, and in a couple more weeks I'll be off to a couple of Southeast Asian countries doing the same thing. I actually learned a lot from reading Ravinder's paper because higher education is not something I specifically focus on in my own research, although I do look at mobilities in general and student mobilities, but concerning younger children. In particular, I appreciated the paper for providing a broad yet comparative overview of the policies and social trends tied to international student movements, as well as Ravinder's call for us to pay more attention to the human security and human rights issues associated with international students. The currency and importance of the topic, of this particular topic, exists on several fronts. First, the steadily growing market in international education in recent years has made it second only to healthcare as an economic sector at the global scale. Second, international student mobility has begun to receive due academic interest after many years of receiving only scant attention from social scientists. Third, it is a topic that finds itself in the news very often these days, including in Singapore. Well, not least in yesterday's Straits Times, as Ravinder pointed out. It not only, and I brought the thing here, featured an article on students' struggle to find lodgings in Sydney, highlighting the overcrowded conditions. I think it was even described as slum conditions of housing there. Dodgy and rogue landlords which exploit students and cheat them of their money. And that's what faces foreign students in a large city in Australia. On top of that, there's actually another article also on international students. It focuses on the British government's plans to encourage companies and charities to sponsor university places for students to get around caps imposed by tight public spending controls that the current British government is putting in place. So it's indeed a very current issue. Much of the literature on international education focuses on international education as a key mechanism by which the middle class seeks to reproduce itself. Indeed, in another paper that Ravinder just published recently, she observed how the development of the international education industry, especially in higher education, is a response to the growing anxieties and desires of middle-class families for upward social mobility, usually over the longer term. This set of literatures usually stresses the life-enhancing and formative potential of the overseas education experience. And this derives from the new social interactions, the intercultural encounters that they come across in the new city that they find themselves in, acquisition of professional networks, and so on at their universities. More specifically, exposure to and immersion in host cultures is seen as accruing to the foreign student a familiarity with the dominant culture in a whole society, which in the longer term will form capital that the owner of that particular capital will have a particular advantage in negotiating the global stage as a working professional. But Ravinder's paper today presents the other side of the coin. She focuses on the internationalization strategies of universities and highlights the role of universities as agents of globalization, mainly via the promotion of the global schoolhouse concept. What was striking for me when reading her paper was the diversity of internationalization projects and the different modes of internationalization strategies that different universities in different countries undertake in response to globalization. First, there is the United States virtuous cycle of excellence model. I like that term that Ravinder provided. This model apparently requires no promotion. The United States has actually no countrywide branding strategy, as Ravinder points out in her paper. It's tied mainly to the prestigious reputation of well-established universities, reinforced yearly by league tables that place them at the top. It's reinforced also by strong endowments, as she pointed out, the popular culture of America as a society, and the multiple postgraduate opportunities there. But is this a model that other countries, especially those with younger universities, can aspire to follow? Is brand America something that any other university can aspire to, or any other country? I don't know. Ravinder has also noted how universities in Asia, the second model, have adopted what perhaps may be called a development model, or perhaps a social transformation model. While the specific strategies amongst the universities differ, Ravinder highlights how the overall thrust in these different countries is seeing an international student body as not only important to diversifying the academic structure and programs of the universities, but also as being central to broader state policies to remake their countries into knowledge-based economies. As such, the universities in Asia, especially the flagship universities, tend to receive strong support in terms of funding and other requisite resources from their governments. I wonder if, Ravinder, you could say more about how effective higher education has been as a channel for these countries in building up these countries' skilled labor force. Does the evidence show that the cultural, political, and other socialization acquired through the years of education in a particular country actually increases the chance of young people staying on in those countries in Asia? Then there's the cash cow entrepreneurial model of Australia and now the UK, where higher fee-paying international students make up for revenue shortfalls in universities when the state pulls back on its funding. Is this commercial approach to international education what universities in Asia have to look forward to in future, given that, as Ravinder pointed out in her talk, high levels of state funding are probably not sustainable in the longer term? Certainly, the need to differentiate fees for local versus PRs versus citizens will continue to be a political issue for our local universities. Greater differentiation makes the locals happier, but also drives down the levels of internationalization. I also found it interesting how, as some countries, for example, Australia and the UK, tighten up their immigration, foreign labor policies, and opportunities for students to stay on after their studies. Other countries jostling for talent are opening up these opportunities and making it easier for students to come and study. So, for example, Singapore even offers a bond, right? You not only have to come, you have to sign a bond and promise to stay for 3 years and work here. What does the research say about how students and their families use education in Asian destinations? Do they use it as a bridge or stepping stone to an ultimate dream destination in the US or UK? Or do they use it in the true two-step migration fashion that Ravinder was talking about in Australia? First step, student visa, second step, PR. Or does two-step migration in Asia mean first step, university in Asia, second step, university in the West? By providing a critical evaluation of the practices and representations surrounding the internationalization strategies of universities and governments with regard to international education, Ravinder also highlights the disjuncture that exists between disembodied representations of host countries as welcomingly multicultural on the one hand, and the embodied experiences faced by international students on the ground on the other. Locals may be skeptical about the need for ethnically diversified university and societal profiles. They may be unhappy about the way taxpayer dollars are being used to subsidize foreigners' education. They may be discontented about the displacement of locals from university places, and so on. Using the example of Indian students in Australia, Ravinder has highlighted how corporate endeavors to promote cosmopolitan-oriented education has many slippages with the lived reality on the ground for students. She noted issues of urban violence, social isolation, class discrimination, racial discrimination, and so on. International students are often deemed not desirable, and they continue to face many of these issues at the urban and social levels, even after they have successfully crossed international borders. In her paper, actually, Ravinder highlights the different levels of borders that international students have to cross. First, the international border, then the urban border, then the social borders, and so on. It is hence timely that Ravinder highlights the rather neglected but significant issue of human rights as tied to student mobilities. Human rights is not an issue often associated with international student migrations. and I think not very often written about in the academic literature. Human rights has often been studied in relation to many other kinds of international migrations, including low-skilled labor migration, transnational refugee movements, human trafficking, and so on. Its scholars recognize that these other forms of migration can create and facilitate the contradictory experiences of migrants and reinforce their vulnerabilities. How much more should we recognize the need to address the issue for international students who are generally young people and who find themselves in culturally different contexts, away from established social networks and family and peer support? What then is the role of governments and institutions of higher learning in engendering ethical expressions of global civic responsibility for international students if they are to be welcomed as longer-term migrants and possible citizens? Now, Ravinda ended her presentation by arguing for the need for a human rights approach and offers Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen's capability approach as a way forward for Asian societies to reimagine human security and human rights for international students. Now, I know nothing about Amartya Sen's capability approach, so upon reading her paper, I had to go read a little bit about Amartya Sen's capability approach. I used the shortcut method. I read a few book reviews, and from what I gathered, while Amartya Sen's arguments in the book Development as Freedom, which he published a year after he was awarded the Nobel Prize, while his arguments have been universally praised as a promising way forward for a more humane society, he has also been critiqued for his lack of a feasible prescription for achieving his stated goals. I also had that feeling reading and listening to the presentation that it remains at a general level, and I wonder whether you could say more, Ravinda, about how we can go about operationalizing the different categories of instrumental freedoms to achieve human security and ensure human rights for student populations, and even more generally. I just want to end by saying that I think the issue of human rights and human security is something that even we should look at for other groups of student migrants, not just at the higher education level. My own research with Brenda focuses more on the younger set of students moving from countries in Asia to other countries in Asia and in the West. One thing I got very envious reading Ravinda's paper because I realized how much wonderful data and data sets exist with regard to higher education. There's very little on education below the tertiary level. I also think it's important to look at younger children's migrations because very often when they move, their numbers may be disguised as other forms of migration. For example, they could be disguised as migration for immigration purposes. But the actual catalyst is probably the students' educational opportunities. Parents may even relocate primarily for their children, but it gets hidden in terms of statistics as migration data. Brenda and I have looked at Chinese professionals in Singapore who move primarily for the father's career, but they also share that a large part of how they decide which city to go to is tied to the quality of education for their children. Also, in terms of our research on study mother children, we have found human rights and security issues there as well. Many of the children of study mothers in Singapore tell us about how they're bullied, how they face racism, not just from their peers, but also from teachers. One student told us that my Indian class or form teacher always looks down on me just because I'm from China. Another one said, my Chinese form teacher calls me China, very derogatorily. And then other students have shared how they have been picked on, bullied by their peers. One boy told us how he was picked on for a year plus until he decided to join the Dragon Boat team, joined the gym, buffed himself up, and after that nobody touched him. So these issues on the ground are real, not just at the tertiary level, but at levels all the way down the education hierarchy. So I'm very glad that you have highlighted these issues, especially the issue of human rights, and I really look forward to hearing how we can actually operationalize the concepts and move them forward. Thank you.